We're going to be looking at our hearts, the motives of our heart. This is a neat text because this is right before he goes to the cross. The next half of the book of John is all about the Passion Week of Jesus. And so we're right at the edge of something that's really amazing is about to happen. And what we're going to see in this text is really a breakdown of the worth of Jesus. And so we're going to look at for ourselves, what is Jesus worth to us? What Jesus has just done is he has, in chapter 11, if you'll remember, he's declared, Mary and Martha have sent people to him, asking him to come. Lazarus is sick. Jesus, we need you to come heal our brother. Jesus delays. Jesus lets Lazarus die. Shows up 4 days later. Lazarus has been in the grave for 4 days. He sort of rebukes Martha and Mary for their lack of faith. He raises Lazarus from the dead in an obvious, unmistakable miracle, something that would have been not only just a feat, but an impossibility. And then many people begin to believe in him. And in that process, the Jews, the leaders, the Sanhedrin, they decide, this is it, we've had enough, he must die. And so Jesus leaves just for a little while, only to return back to Bethany, back to the house of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and that's where we're going to pick up. And what you're going to see is they're going to have a celebration for Jesus. And each person is going to play a role in the celebration of Jesus. And the point that you're going to see in this text is you're really going to get to see the difference between somebody's heart who is fully committed and in love with Jesus and sees him not just as a miracle worker, not just as something to get something from, but as the God of the universe, the creator of all things. Somebody who sees him that way and everybody else who doesn't. And we're going to get to see the heart, but more importantly, we're going to see just how worthy Jesus is, and we're going to get to ask the questions of ourselves. What is he worth to me? Because that's really what the text is going to show us. It's going to show each of us how much is Jesus worth to you. So I'm going to start with a couple of analogies. We get our value of things typically from an economic concept known as supply and demand, correct? This is Alfred Marshall's 1776. This is going to sound like I know what I'm talking about, but I don't. 1776 Principles of Economics book that he wrote, his publication, that is still in use today to balance the market, to set prices. And we understand this. Supply and demand goes like this. If you have a lot of something, and you have little demand for that something, well, the price drops, correct? Because you got a lot of it and nobody wants it. We have a lot of office furniture in our new building that nobody wants. I have to pay people to come get it. Nobody wants this stuff. That's supply and demand. The opposite is true. If I've got a little bit of something and everybody wants it, what happens to my price? I get to set the market, right? I get to set the price, whatever I want. See, that's interesting because that's an economic drive for how we value and how we find worth in something. But then there's another way, and this was really interesting, and I found this out. So I had an old Toyota Land Cruiser, you guys know this, and I sold it. And so before I sold it, I took about 2 weeks, not because I didn't have a buyer, because I couldn't figure out what it was worth. I didn't know. I loved it. I knew I knew that what my heart felt about it. I knew how hard it was for me to let God rip it from my hands, right? But I didn't know how much it was worth. I started calling around. What would anybody buy this car for? Didn't have an air conditioner, had 300 and something thousand miles on it. It was awesome. But I had no clue. And see, the worth in that situation is dictated by the heart, right? It's dictated by what I loved about that, and what I wanted from this, and how much it was worth to me. If you came up and you offered me too little, I would have said, get out of here. No, of course not. And you could have said, but Chris, that's what the market demands. I don't care. I don't care what the market demands. This is worth way more to me than what the market demands. So there's two sets of ways that we find worth in things, right? One is an economic concept, and the other is in our hearts. What does it mean to us in our heart? This is why when Jesus said, and we're going to read this text later, in Matthew 22, he wants us to love him with all of our heart. He doesn't want us to just follow the law. He doesn't want us to just be good people. He wants our heart, our love. Because in that, we begin to understand the worth of Jesus. And that's really what this is about. We're going to see this in this text. Give you another quick example. I've got two bowls here. All right? This is a bowl that I eat cereal out of. It's pretty clean. It's plastic. It's just a simple bowl that you could buy for $1 at the dollar store. When me and Jolene got married, some crazy person bought us this. It's kind of dusty because it doesn't get used. I'm glad I'm over this tiled floor. This is a Steuben glass bowl. Does anybody here know what Steuben glass is? A few of you? Praise God. It's signed. It's got the name on it somewhere, scratched into the crystal. Somebody gave us this on our wedding day, and it's awesome. It costs like $800. Not joking. I don't know what it's worth today. But here's the problem. We use that word worth. What's this worth? I use this all the time. This is my bowl. When I want cereal, this is my go-to guy. This sits on my shelf. The market says it's worth whatever, but I don't eat out of it. It doesn't feed me. You see where I'm going at? We set the value of things oftentimes based on how useful they are to us, what they mean to us, what our heart decides they're worth. And I'm telling you guys this because as we get into this text, we're really going to be confronted with the reality that we're going to find that a lot of us don't find Jesus that worthy. We're not going to find Jesus as worthy as some things that we're going to be confronted with. So take a look at your text. Look at verse 1 of chapter 12. And let's set the scenario here. So Jesus, he's coming back to Jerusalem, or back to Bethany specifically, which is just about a couple miles outside of Jerusalem at the time. And this is right before the Passover. This is the week Jews would come back and have a 6-day kind of celebration / get yourself ready for the Passover kind of thing. And so Jews are starting to show up all over Jerusalem. And notice what he says in verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And so they gave a dinner for him there. Stop for just a second. Lazarus, Mary, Martha, they have decided we are going to celebrate Jesus. Right after he raised Lazarus, he left. He got away because they were trying to kill him. The Sanhedrin wanted him dead. They were sending out spies all over the place saying, hey, if you see Jesus, come back, tell us where he is. We want to arrest him. We want to kill him. So Jesus goes away because his time has not come. And now he's come back because his time has come. And in this moment of him finally coming back, they want to celebrate. They didn't have a chance to celebrate before. They didn't have a chance to say thank you properly for what Jesus did in raising Lazarus from the dead. And so in the midst of this, you've got this party that's being thrown, this celebration in honor of Jesus, and they've invited the who's who of their friends. And so there's a group of people here, and it's an amazing moment. And notice what happens. You find that Martha is serving. Lazarus was one of those reclining with Jesus at the table. This would be a situation, the table is low. They're going to be laying down sort of around a table. The women are going to be standing around serving. And you're going to begin to see this pattern that's happening. Notice in verse 2 something. As we find out, we're going to see three things now that dictate to show us just what Jesus is worth to the heart that's completely surrendered to him. When we see Jesus like Mary and Martha and Lazarus do, this is what you're going to see. Remember, before Lazarus was raised from the dead, Jesus had to convince them that he was the resurrection and the life. Do you think he has to convince them now? Not at all. They know absolutely who he is. Watch what happens. Look back in verse 2. It says, so they gave a dinner for him there. And notice what you see. Martha served. Martha served. And what you're going to notice is that Jesus is worthy of her service, right? I'm just going to stop for just a second because I believe this is a reality that we all probably grasp. If you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you recognize that you've been given gifts, you've been around church enough probably that you realize that there's a lot to do to serve God and to serve the Lord. And a lot of times we get into a place of service because it makes us feel good, right? I guarantee you band members who are up here serving, they put in a lot of time, but they love music, right? They love what they do, so there's a kind of a give and take to it. They are serving the body of Christ. They're putting in hours of practice and time so that they can be excellent and lead us all before the throne of God in their service. But there's also a heart that they love to do this, right? If you have at all gone back and worked with our children's ministry, God bless you. Because there's some people in here that they're like, that's not my gift. They're praying for you to step in and help serve, right? And they're thankful for that because you love that. That's your thing. I was talking to Quinn yesterday, and we were talking about, I did student ministry for 20 years, and I'm with his basketball team, and this last week I was coaching them, and the other coach forgot the book with the devotional in it. And so I grabbed my phone and I pulled up the text and I got everybody together and I led them through a devotional about Christ and who he is, just from a text in 1 Corinthians that I'd been studying at home. And Quinn couldn't believe it. He was like, how did you just... And these kids that were grabbing each other and pushing and spitting on each other, all of a sudden they were like watching a cartoon, couldn't get their eyes loose. And Quinn was like, how did you do that? I'm like, bro, this is my lane, dude. This is what God has built me for, and that's my service, and it makes me joy-filled. See, Jesus to all of us is worth our service. Let me give a couple of places that in the Bible where you've recognized this. Romans 12:2. This is a very famous verse coming off of a chapter where Paul is talking to the Romans, where he's describing the aspects of how the church is to work together as he gets into this. And in verse 2 he says, I appeal to you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to offer or present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Some of your versions that you may have may say your act of service, your spiritual act of service, or your service of worship. You give yourself away, your living body, not just your mind, but you actually give your time. You are like Martha, willing to do whatever it is, serve Jesus like a king he is, right? We're ready to do that. If we have a mission trip planned, everybody wants to go. Everybody wants to serve. Here's another text. This is found in Colossians chapter 2, verse 23 through 24. Paul exhorts the church at Colossae. He says, whatever you do, do your work heartily, as unto the Lord and not for men. We get this part, right? This is the idea that we were built as ministers of service. And so when I asked you this, could you serve the Lord as Martha is, you're probably going to say yes, right? because he's worth that much to you. Let's keep going. So if he's worth your service, let me ask you this. Is he worth your wealth? Oh, now we're crossing lines, right? Is he worth your wealth? Look in verse 3. So we see kind of Martha's contribution to the party. And now we're going to see Mary's contribution to the party. Mary, therefore, took a pound of an expensive ointment made from nard. I have no idea what nard is. And neither do you. And it does not matter. It could say doTERRA on it. Or Young Living, right? Is that one? Or HTC. No, what's that one? CBD. THC. TC. What's the other one? No, my bad. We just may have differences of opinion. That's just... It doesn't matter, right? It's nard. But what's interesting is its worth. It's a pound. In the Greek, the word is litra. It's about 11 and a half ounces. So you can imagine it's probably the size of a Coke can of nard that she brings, this expensive ointment. Notice what she does with it. She took this and she anointed the feet of Jesus. So they're reclined at this table. He's laying down. Lazarus is across from him. Probably his disciples and other men are all around. And everybody's talking and enjoying it. And Martha is serving, and there's food and there's laughter. And Mary's portion of the service here, of the party, is to come and anoint Jesus' feet with this ointment that we find out later is worth about 300 days' wages. Think of what your salary is, everyone, for a year. Subtract about 2 months, and you've got it. That's insane. And she's not just going to go, like when my wife buys essential oils, and it's like, don't waste that. I'm like, rubbing it all over me. What are you doing? That was $80. Why did you buy that? She doesn't just give him a drop. She pours it on him. She coats him with it. And we know this because we're going to find out later that the perfume filled the entirety of the place. It was so aromatic and beautiful that it affected everybody. She pours this on his feet. See, Mary's job, and I believe this is what happened. This is just me. I believe that Mary and Martha and Lazarus, this was something that they pooled together. I think they all were in on this. Probably even maybe more people were in on this. You imagine taking out of your 401k, your salary, your savings or whatever, and going and buying something of that value, a year's wages. Would you do that for Jesus? Would you take that much? Some of you in this building campaign have. Some of you have said he is way worth that. The mission of the gospel of Jesus Christ and what's happening through Benchmark Bible Church is worth it. And some of you have done that. Can you imagine as I don't know who's doing what, but as I see numbers because I'm keeping track of it. We have other people that account for all that. But as I see numbers, can you imagine what I'm thinking? I can't believe it. How do they do that? How do you give like that? How does Mary and Martha and Lazarus give like this? Is Jesus worth it? Proverbs 3, 9 through 10 spells out how we should handle our wealth. It says this. It says, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will be bursting with wine. He tells us that when we give, he's going to overflow it with blessing. And this isn't a prosperity doctrine comment or anything like that. This is a reality of the gracious heart of our Lord to lavish. He's going to always outgive us. He just is. And it may not be in physical things that we want and our idea of it, but I guarantee you that when you give of it, whether it's your service or your wealth or your time or your energy, he's going to overflow back. He's not going to let you get to a deficit. It never works that way. Matthew chapter 6 gives us a beautiful example of this. Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount explains this concept that we're not to put our wealth and the things of this earth above the things of God. We're to balance that out, and God is to take preeminence over that. In chapter 6 of Matthew 19 through 21, he says, "Don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, because moth and rust will destroy, and thieves are going to break in, and they're going to steal it." You think you've got the padlock set? You think you've got the clicker in the driveway clicked to the right button so that no one's going to take your car and your belongings, and you're wrong. They're gonna, right? Don't do that. Don't make these things of this world your focus. Notice, keep going. He says, verse 29 or 20 verse, "But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven." Why? Because you can't lose that, right? And then he makes this amazing statement there in verse 21. "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also," right? Now we're getting to the point of the motives of what's truly going on inside of us. When we talk about worth, we're not talking about supply and demand. How much Jesus is there in the world, and what's the demand for Jesus? Well, that's going to determine Jesus' worth in my life. We're not doing that. This is Jesus is a rare automobile. Well, that's a horrible analogy. I should have thought through that. He's worth more than what you think and what you want to give for it. I'll give my service to Jesus. I'll give a little of my wealth. Right? See the progression? We're all like, service, good. Let's do that. Wealth, slow down. But it gets worse. When we're starting to determine the worth of Jesus, it moves beyond service, it moves beyond wealth. And notice what else they give. They pool their money, 300 days' wages. She's over there anointing his feast. Finish the verse. Look at part B of verse 3 here. Notice what she does. She anoints his feet, the feet of Jesus, and she wipes his feet with her hair. And then the whole house is filled with the fragrance of the perfume. We just crossed the line, didn't we? We crossed the line a point earlier, but now we really crossed the line. Is Jesus worth your humiliation? Is he worth your being slandered? Is he worth the world coming after you? Is he worth your embarrassment? Because that's what's happening here to Mary. I don't know about you. I'm losing my hair. But if I had long hair, that's the last thing I'd be rubbing on any of your feet. We have this saying in my house. I'll get a kiss from my kids or something, and I'll get butter in my beard. Men with beards, you ever get butter in your beard? We call it butterbeard. We're super creative. You get butter in your beard. Just try it. Do this, fellas. Go home. Put a little butter in your beard and then just leave it. Not margarine. No. The real deal. Right? Organic butter. Because in about 30 minutes, it's going to start reeking. It's nasty. It smells like throw up. It's gross. So when you eat a piece of toast in the morning, fellas, you may not even know this. But I'll get it like over on the side because I'm like Jovi, right? We're very similar. And we get, we put the food in our face. And so I've got butter over here, and somebody gives me a kiss, and they're like, "Dad, butterbeard." What? Right? Now imagine butter hair on your head. Imagine what a Jew walks through in the streets with their sandals in the dirt, in the mud. And we know that Jesus in this situation would have had probably his feet washed before they reclined at the table, because that was a very common Jewish custom of a ceremony that was done for cleansing purposes. That when you walked into a house, there was a washing that you did to take so that you could remain clean before the Lord as you walked into a house. And you didn't contaminate anybody else to make them what they would call ceremonially unclean either. So we can believe that Jesus at this point was washed, that his feet were relatively clean. But does that matter? If you came out of the shower, I'm not doing that for you. But would you do it for Jesus? Would I do it for Jesus? See, this is another level of humiliation that I think that this takes things up a notch. Jesus is worth it to her. Why is Jesus worth her humiliation? I almost wonder if Mary and Martha farkled before this happened, right? It's you, girl. You wipe his feet with your hair. Are we in a place where we would be willing to give up our name, our reputation, our pride for the creator of the world? See, that's why she can do this. That's why this is okay. That's why this, to her, it was probably easy. They were fighting, I bet, volunteering, wrestling before Jesus got there for the nard. Because they knew who he was and what he was worth, and that this was going to bless him. And not only bless him, but there was a future, and Jesus is going to say it, almost a prophetic answer for her doing this, which had to do with his death and his burial. You got to remember, this was probably a custom very similar to what we do to embalming. When a person would die, they would take the body and they would immediately begin this process of covering it and with perfumes and spices so that the body would not reek as it decayed. And Jesus didn't get that. Remember when Jesus came off the cross, did Mary and Martha and everybody have any time to prepare his body? They did not. They wrapped him and they stuck him in the grave. And on Sunday morning, they came back to do this to him. But he never got that chance because he rose. And she does it now. Now she gets to ceremonially do this. Let me give you some verses. I think this is amazing. This is the proper action for the children of the Lord. When you recognize who Jesus is and what his worth is, this is the proper action. We see this in Luke chapter 5, a very similar situation. Jesus is, in this text in Luke, is calling his disciples, and he's with Peter, and they're out on the boat in the water, and Peter and his friends have been fishing all day long, and all night long, and they haven't caught any fish. And all of a sudden, Jesus shows up, gets in the boat. He says, "Take me out, let's go fishing." They say, "Jesus, there's nothing to catch. They're not biting." He says, "Throw the net in. Trust me, Peter, just throw the net in." And he throws the net in. It begins to sink the boat with the weight of the catch. Peter stops what he's doing. And in verse 8 of chapter 5 of Luke, he says, he falls at his knees of Jesus, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man." The natural reaction when you have an encounter with the Lord is to fall down before him and bow your head and get low and go, "Please, don't look at me. I'm not worthy." The posture of Simon is the same posture of Mary. Let's take it back from this moment in the Bible, 400 years. Let's look at Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 6. He's taken up in a vision to the throne room of God. Isaiah's before the Lord, and he sees the throne room and all that's in it. And as he sees God, look at his reaction. "Woe is me, for I am ruined, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." This level of humiliation is proper for the children of God who have experienced and encountered the God of creation in the person of Jesus Christ. This is right for us. But is he worth that to you? Is he worth that level? Is he worth our service? Yeah, Chris. Is he worth us giving up our wealth? Maybe not a year's salary, but yes, he's worth that. Is he worth you embarrassing yourself in front of everybody you love and know and that loves you? Is he worth you sharing his name at your office? Is he worth you sharing his name with your atheist friend? With your friend who doesn't believe politically like you do? With your neighbor? How about at your school? How about with the desk right next to you? Is he worth that for you? Or is he just some dude? And is this just something we do on Sunday? We come and it just kind of makes us feel good. We sing, we knocks each other. Yeah, we're good. Or do we truly find him worthy of all that we see in this text? Because I'll tell you what, Judas does not. That's where we're going next. Judas does not. And so what we're going to see next in the text is, as we get into this party, Mary's broken this. She's laid it on his feet. The perfume is filling the house. There's now going to be a visceral reaction from Judas. And we all, if you understand or know, been around church much, you know that Judas is the one that betrays Jesus. He's going to do that in about 6 days. I think Judas is probably already pretty fed up with Jesus at this point. He's seen the miracles. He's been around. He wants Jesus to be the Messiah that comes and militarily kicks out the Romans, and all he's noticing is that everybody is just trying to kill Jesus. And so you can imagine that in Judas's heart, there's probably this angst of, man, when is this part going to stop? And when am I going to get to be the king's money manager? Because that's what he is here. He's the keeper of the coin purse, so to speak. And so we're going to find out now what happens when we don't understand the worth of Jesus. Judas doesn't see Jesus as the Messiah, as the King of the Jews, as the God of creation. He doesn't see Jesus like Mary, Martha, and Lazarus do. And we're going to see that in this text, because what you find whenever we miss, and this is for us, whenever we misunderstand the value of Jesus Christ, the first thing that we do is we begin to elevate ourselves. We put our wants, our desires above the desires of the Lord. Right? You've been there. You've experienced that. We grab the wheel. We do what we want. You ever been in a situation of pain or suffering? You grab the wheel. You do what you want to do rather than resting and waiting on the Lord to renew your strength, to mount you up on wings like eagles. You take control. You do not wait. We jerk the wheel. We're going to make this. We're going to fix this. We're going to stop this pain. That's what we do. We elevate self above the will of God. Naturally. Naturally, because we're broken and sinful. Watch what Judas does. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Now stop. That's a great question. How many of you would have said the exact same thing? Where's my wife? If I go get my wife's little bottle of frankincense, ladies. Frankincense is expensive. I don't know. She just tells me not to use it. If I go get my wife's bottle of frankincense and I walk up to the dog and, you stink, and I dump it on her, what's she going to do? You've wasted this. If anything, my wife wouldn't say this, but if anything, you could have taken this and sold it back and given the money to the poor. Right? There's nothing wrong necessarily with what Judas is saying here. It makes total economic sense. But to Judas, he's looking at the worth of Jesus based on a supply and demand situation, correct? The motives of his heart is very different from the motives of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, which are they love him. They are in love with Jesus. And Judas is not. He's looking at supply and demand, not at the glory of God incarnate in human flesh. That's not what he sees. And so he just sees it as a waste. Is it a waste? Is your humiliation a waste? Is your wealth a waste? Is your service a waste? Notice we get a little parenthetical expression here. Notice what happens. It says, and he said this not because he cared about the poor. He didn't care about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charged the money back, he used to help himself to what was put in it. From time to time, Jesus' ministry was given to because it's what kept them going. And people would, like a church, they would give to him and they would funnel money to him. And over time, as they would go, Judas would just kind of, nobody's looking. He'd put a little in his back pocket. Nobody knew any better. He's a thief. He's thinking, 300 denarii. If I've been taking 10% off the top, dude, that's like a month for me. That's a month. Why was this not sold and given to the poor? See my point? He elevated himself above the glory of God. Matthew 22, this is what I was talking about earlier. Jesus tells us that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart. And then love your neighbor as yourself, right? See, Judas doesn't even love his neighbor as himself. He really loves himself. And then he put the poor, his neighbor, and then he put Jesus. So that when we devalue the person of Jesus, we begin to see, we start to look at the Bible through the lens of me rather than looking at myself through the lens of the Bible. Does that make sense? When we devalue the person of Jesus, the Bible and the truths of God, I begin to see them through my desires, my wants, the lens of my perception, as opposed to seeing myself through the lens of God's perception. And that's the flip that was made here. That's how the devaluing started. That's how it got turned upside down. And not only do we value self above the Lord, but when we do this, we begin to have our priorities broken. Our priorities are messed up. And now everything gets out of whack. And now you can't even on a supply and demand situation, perfectly evaluate what worth is in the spiritual realm, because you have no basis to do so. When self becomes the priority, when the things that you want become priority, everything else falls apart. Look in John, Jesus says something to him. He begins to rebuke him. He says, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." We're going to look at this in two little parts real quickly. He says, the first part, leave her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. There's a couple ways that you can look at it. You have to look at the word it here. The pronoun it is difficult to translate in context, because some theologians believe that the it is his burial. Her heart towards his burial. That she's doing something now that should not be rebuked. She's not going to get a chance to do this. Her heart is perfectly in line and in tune to do something. Don't leave her alone, so that she may keep this heart to the day to my burial. But if you really look at it in the Greek, the it here is, I believe, is truly focused on, in the context, what she's doing. The breaking of this peace. The totality of what's happening here is an instrument of worship that should not be rebuked. Some people believe that literally it should say, she has kept it for the day of my burial. In other words, she's been preparing for this this is a great act of worship. Don't rebuke her. I tend to believe that that's a better translation. She's doing this for me. This is for me. Judas, what's wrong with you? And then he goes along with Judas's charade, right? The poor you will always have with you. And is he right? 2,000 years later, do we have the poor with us? Yes, we do. I'm right here. Right? You're right here. There's poor everywhere. It's a relative position, correct? Some are more poor than others. Some are destitute. We have that around us all the time. They're still with us. Do we elevate the poor above the gospel of Jesus Christ? Friends, you do not. What do you get when you elevate the taking care of the poor over the gospel and the truth of God's word? You get what is known as the social gospel, correct? And what happens when you only give the social gospel? You don't give the gospel. You don't get the blood of Jesus. You don't get the resurrection power of Jesus. You don't get the Spirit indwelling discernment and light of the world living in you with the social gospel. Is it good? Absolutely. Is Jesus saying don't give to the poor? No, he's not. But he's saying don't sacrifice the person of Jesus Christ and the gospel for the sake of the poor, because they miss it and you miss it, and then you don't understand my worth. And here's what happens. If we elevate self and we get our priorities about the gospel of Jesus Christ mixed up, the progression leads us to a place where ultimately we get crushed by our sin. When your priorities of who Jesus is and what the gospel is about and the value of Jesus Christ in your life, where you're not walking, you're not living, you're just going through the motions, mediocre in your relationship with Jesus, ultimately you will get crushed by the weight of your sin. And here's what I mean by that. We're going to step out of this text for just a second, and we're going to look at what happens to Judas. Judas, why did we do this? This money could be taken and given to the poor. Why are we not using this? Matthew 27 gives us the result of Judas's misunderstanding of the worth of Jesus Christ. It says this in verse 3 of chapter 27 of Matthew. Then when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind. And he brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. Now, he doesn't even call him the Messiah. He just realizes that he knew Jesus didn't deserve death. He thought that by bringing the Jews to Jesus, that Jesus was going to go, and there was going to be this big glory of God explosion, and everybody was going to fly back, and Jesus was going to become the Messiah that Judas wanted him to be. I'm going to force Jesus to do it my way, the way I think it should be done. And when it didn't happen, and Jesus is being beaten, and the blood is starting to come from his nose and his mouth and his body, and he's like, oh, what have I done? I betrayed innocent blood. And they said to him, what is that to us? We don't care. You take care of it yourself. In verse 5, and throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed, and he went and he killed himself. He hung himself. You know why he did that? Because he had so devalued the person of Jesus Christ and what Jesus Christ had come to do. He had no concept of grace. See, this is what happens when we take control and we don't see that Jesus is worth more than our service, more than our wealth, way more than our humiliation. When we don't get that, then you don't get what he came to do. You don't have a good concept of his grace. And you're not prepared to be the person that says, I am the foremost of sinners. I am the worst of all people. I believe, and this is just me, church, you can take this, you can leave it. This is my opinion. I believe that to properly minister to the world, you can't do so if you think that you're better than the world. If I think for a second that I'm better than you, I cannot stand here and do the work of the Lord. You can't stand where you stand with the influence that you have and do the work of the Lord unless you are the chief of sinners. And Judas didn't get the grace. See, the reason you can say I can say I'm the chief of sinners is one, because I am. Paul he was in his head and saying he didn't know me. He didn't know what I've done. I know what I've done. He didn't. So I could stand easily, and I don't know what he did either. I mean, let's be honest. I just read it in the book. But I know what I've done, and I can easily say I'm way worse than he is. I know it, because I feel my humiliation. I feel it, and I've experienced it. But I understand the grace. And I ain't going to hang myself, because the weight of my sin ain't crushing me. It crushed Jesus. You see what I'm saying? It crushed him. And church, if you're sitting here today and you've misplaced the worth of God in your life and the worth of Christ in your life, and you're feeling crushed, that's why. That's why. And it's super simple. I'm going to read you one more verse. It's super simple. This is found in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 4 through 5. If Judas would have only had this, I think he would have gone to the temple like normal. He would have tried to reconcile with the chief priests and the Sanhedrin, and they would have turned him away like normal. And then he would have had nothing to do, and he would have ran to this verse if he'd have had it. It says this in verse 4 and 5, but God. Stop for a second. You know I'm not giving you the first part of the verses here for a reason. Right? Because it's Judas' story, basically. You're the worst of the worst of the worst. But God, being rich in mercy because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, made us alive together with Christ. We get the resurrection and the life. Mary and Martha and Lazarus got that Jesus was the resurrection and the life, and by his grace, he has made us alive with Christ because of the power of Christ, through the blood of Christ. And that is how we as a church literally change the world, is through first putting Jesus and valuing him the way he should be valued, like Mary, Martha, and Lazarus did.